Hi guys, it's that time of year again. It's time for the mid-year book free guard tag, which is also always with me a bit of a best of worst of the year so far video. So I have read about 60 titles so far this year, some of them, about 15 of them, very short ones, short stories or novellas. But I've also read some longer historical novels and fantasy novels. I've read very few new releases this year, 2023 releases, but I really made a dent into my home library, and at the same time I was also quite good with reading books when I bought them or quickly after I bought them. They just weren't new releases. On the contrary, most of the time they were quite old releases that I got from online used bookshops. But enough with the statistics, let's get right into it and start with the first tag question, which is, of course, you know the drill by now. What is the best book that you've read so far this year? Now, I feel like I have to preface my answer by saying that my reading year hasn't been that great, to be honest, quality-wise in 2023. I have read very few books, barely any, maybe none, that really blew my mind. I haven't given a single book 5 stars so far this year. And I'm still waiting for a book to come my way this year that I think is going to be a new favorite. There have been some books, though, that I didn't think it was a total waste of time reading. One of them definitely was The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons, the first book in a fantasy series, A Chorus of Dragons, which I enjoyed a lot, this first book, because it is, for a change, a new-ish fantasy series that is not complete trash, which is unfortunately hard to find these days. This will be the subject of a later question and answer, though. Another one is The House of Doors by Tan Tran Eng, the brand new Tan Tran Eng novel. This is a rather short and very quiet book, but it is powerful in its quietness. It will come up again later too. If I had to name a single best book so far, though, and I think I do, it would be Grendel by John Gardner, because it is just such original, creative fun, the way Gardner uses the figure of Grendel, the monster from Beowulf, to explore and demonstrate the mechanisms of self-awareness and self-delusion and the social dimensions of identity formation, and the way that these things are kind of hidden themes in the epic of Beowulf. It's just such fun. If the choice of main character for a book like this had even been slightly less bold and brazen, it would have been totally annoying and like the fake, deep, pompous sermon of a college student who has taken one class and now has to show off all his great new knowledge. But as it is, it was just such a almost psychedelic ride. And then we have the best sequel that I've read so far this year. And I haven't even read a handful of sequels, I think, this year. But even in larger company, I think the book that would stand out is The Disorderly Nights by Dorothy Dunnett, the first book in the infamous Lymond Chronicles about the adventures and exploits of the Scottish laird Francis Crawford of Lymond. This book has been the most stressful one to read in the series so far, because a large part of it takes place on Malta and in Tripoli during the siege and conquest of Tripoli by the Ottoman army in, I think, the year 1551 or thereabouts. And Dorothy Dunnett doesn't sanitize or cutesify her historical fiction or brush over things. And while the character of Lyman and his capabilities are wildly exaggerated, the situations and events that he gets himself into themselves are very realistic, often uncomfortably so. I absolutely love this series, and I need to pick up the fourth book, Pawn and Frankincense, really soon. Because while the first book in the series, The Game of Kings, is a complete standalone, and the second book is a complete story in and of itself, this book is very much an in-between book that leads up to the events in the later part of the series that I am now curious and excited about. Question 3 is to name a new release that I haven't read yet but want to. And there are quite a few. One is Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. Now, this is a space opera, and I'm not usually a big fan of space operas. It's just a setting that I don't usually enjoy. However, Emily Tesh is the author of Silver in the Wood, a British folk horror novella, which I absolutely loved. And however, Emily Tesh is the author of Silver in the Wood, a British folk horror novella that I absolutely loved. And I'm just curious to see what she does in a space opera environment. And who knows, maybe if she does it, I'll end up liking a space opera. And then, kind of conversely, we have The Witch King by Martha Wells, who is, among other things, the author of the Murderbot series. So this is a fantasy novel by an author who has, I think, mainly written science fiction in the past, or definitely written a lot of science fiction. Now, I've only read the first Murderbot novella. I liked it, but I never felt compelled to pick up the rest because Martha Wells' prose, at least in the Murderbot diaries, is just a bit too much window pane prose for me. You know, the kind of prose that you don't notice it's there. It's transparent like a window pane. You can look through it at the story without any obstacles because it is so characterless. There are no standout features that would distract you from the story, but I kind of like when there's the obstacle of the prose and the style that, you know, makes me look at things in a different way. So I'm curious to see if that might be the case in The Witch King. Perhaps Martha Wells' writing is different in fantasy novels than in science fiction novels. Who knows? And then we have Puzzle for Two by Josh Lanyon, who is one of my go-to authors this year. She writes gay crime and romantic suspense, and this is her newest release. I'm just waiting for it to become a deal on Kindle because I'm not paying €7 for a book like this in ebook format. And finally, the last newest release that I can think of right now, and the biggest deal for me, is the new novel by Connie Willis. I didn't even know that there was a new Connie Willis in the works until it came out a week ago, I think. And it is called The Road to Roswell. Now, I will buy anything new by Connie Willis. She is one of my all-time favorite authors. But, however, the title, the setting, and the cover image, I think, make it safe to say that this is probably a comedic novel. However, I would even read a serious novel about Roswell and aliens in New Mexico if it's written by Connie Willis. My most anticipated release of the second half of the year. Now, this was a tough question because I'm kind of out of the loop. I have no idea what's coming out in the second half of the year or beyond. The only one that I know that I'm interested in is a fantasy novella by a favorite romance author of mine, Anita Sunday. She usually writes contemporary romance, and now she has apparently strayed into the fantasy genre. And I'm very curious to see what she does in this new environment. The novel, it's full novel length, and it's called The King's Man. And now my favorite question, my biggest disappointments. Of those, I have had a lot. So this selection that I'm going to give you is only the worst of the worst disappointments of the year so far. So most of these books are books that I've had on my list for a long time, so the disappointment felt all the worse for it. So first we have Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. This reads like a 14-year-old had read a Wikipedia article on Nigeria, or roughly Nigerian tribal life, and then written a short book about it. It is that deep. The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Each and every Vietnam War movie that I've watched accomplishes more than this book. It's like a watered down version of All Quiet on the Western Front. Extremely watered down, like one drop of wine in an ocean. Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood. He could have walked through the streets of Berlin and tapped people on the shoulder at random, and he would almost certainly have assembled a more interesting and less annoying group of people than he came up with in this book. And that really says a lot. Nothing Like the Sun by Anthony Burgess. He made Shakespeare boring, I'll give him that. That's quite a feat. I don't know what went wrong here. It's just an extremely boring, like a march through a list of bullet points from Shakespeare's CV that Anthony worked off in this book. I adored his Christopher Marlowe novel, A Dead Man in Deptford. If you're interested in his Elizabethan novels, I'd recommend that you go directly there instead of reading the book about the more famous of the two playwrights. How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. Cli-fi dystopian written by a completely talentless author and mind who was artificially made into a phenomenon because he is in the literary critic scene and was hyped by his peers. It's embarrassing. To name just a few, I could go on and on. In fact, I'm reading what is shaping up to be one of the biggest disappointments ever for me. It's Afterlives by the Nobel laureate Abdulrazak Gurnah. This should be fascinating. It is set in East Africa in German colonial times. It starts even before the First World War, and I think it goes on until the beginning of the Second World War. The problem with this is that it is written in a very detached style. It feels like very old school storytelling, like here is our character and these are his adventures, and we don't get a very close perspective, and that makes everything that the characters experience seem very trite and trivial because we don't really see the psychological and emotional consequences of it very well. And in addition, all the events, all the situations that are described here in this book are very mundane, kind of. I mean, this is a setting and a time and place about which I know very little, so everything should have been new and mind-blowing for me, and instead I feel like I've heard and seen it all before. This is a huge disappointment. I don't think I'll pick up anything else by this author. Looking for recommendations for books with a similar setting. Okay, on to more positive things again. The biggest positive surprise, that was definitely Grendel, in the sense that I'm surprised that I've heard no more than one booktuber talk about this ever. And it is apparently such a modern classic. I'm surprised that more people aren't picking it up. Maybe now they will, who knows? A book that made me cry. The House of Doors, the new novel by Tan Chuan Eng. Because this is a story about stories that can't be told and about what that circumstance does to the people whose stories they are. This may sound very cryptic. I have yet to talk about this book in depth. I will do so in my next recent reads video. A book that made me happy is The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons, which is the first book in a 5-book epic fantasy series called A Chorus of Dragons. This made me happy because I had almost given up hope that I was ever again going to find new epic fantasy that is fresh and creative and absorbing and neither stuffy by the book bro fantasy nor any of those that undercooked YA-ish trash of middle of the road fanfiction quality that so many fantasy publishers are putting out at the moment. The Ruin of Kings almost comes close to this kind of book style-wise. However, the complexity of the world that is described and also the unusual narrative style save it from falling into that category. I'm so happy that I've found a new immersive fantasy series. And I think Jen Lyons, I'd also name her as a new favorite author. That is question number 9. Question 10, newest fictional crush. Grendel, obviously. No. Maybe Jared Blythe, a new central character in the Lyman Chronicles, because he is kind of a noble idiot with a heart of gold. Well, idiot in the sense that he is very naive in the way that he thinks everybody is as guileless and straightforward a person as he is. So he doesn't really recognize psychopathy and narcissism because he is so far removed from those things as a character. But he also doesn't recognize how sometimes duplicity is necessary to defeat those kinds of enemies. So he can be blind to goodness as well. He is a very similar character to Will Scott in the first book and goes through kind of a similar story, a similar epiphany and character development in the third book. And unlike Will Scott, he is going to accompany us in the second half of the series. So I'm looking forward to seeing much more from him, because it may have sounded like he's a very exasperating character, and he is, but he is also admirable, I think, in his straightforwardness. Question number 12 asks for the best book to movie adaptation that I've watched this year, and I haven't watched any. I don't know, I don't remember if I've watched any movie at all this year. If I have, it can't have been this great because I don't remember it. So I was going to skip this question, but then I remembered that I watched 3 adaptations in ballet form this year. I've gone to the ballet a lot this year because at the beginning of the year in January, I discovered that the cheap standing spots are really, really fantastic. You get a great view of the stage and the people in your row. You are the tallest persons in your section, so there's never a taller person than you in front of you who can obstruct your view. And so I went to the ballet all the time, and I've seen 3 book to stage adaptations. 2 are Shakespeare plays. One is Romeo and Juliet, which was, I think, my least favorite ballet because, I'm generally not a fan of these traditional story ballets. And Romeo and Juliet by John Cranko is one of the most, it's as traditional as they come. So in this ballet, for the first time in the whole season, for me, the music by Prokofiev was the real star that outshone the dancing. Not the dancing so much, more like the production as a whole. The second play adaptation that I've watched was A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is, of course, my favorite Shakespeare play, and the production by John Neumeier is just so magical, but also so funny. It really captures the spirit of the play, and it's a very faithful adaptation too. So I'm not sure if you're able to understand everything if you have never read or watched the Shakespeare play, but if you're familiar with it, you're going to have the time of your life watching this ballet. But I also really liked Coppelia, which is an adaptation, or it is inspired by The Sandman by A.T.R. Hoffmann. The original ballet is from either the 1890s or even the 1870s, from Russia. But I watched a newish production from the 1970s by Roland Petit. And this one, so this ballet is set in a military context, and this new adaptation production takes this setting and exaggerates it completely, and it's almost a satire, really. And this is the only way in which this setting works nowadays, I think, at least for me, definitely. But the way it was so funny. I had the time of my life watching it, quite surprisingly. I didn't expect it to be such a great and funny evening. I absolutely love this company. I've fallen in love with this ballet company, and I can't wait to see them all again next season in September or October. The most beautiful book I've bought or received so far this year. There aren't that many books that are beautiful on the outside, although I think the A Chorus of Dragons series makes a very good impression as an ensemble. There is, however, one book that I I found for free in a little free library, or rather a big free library, because it is this one. It's Die Alpen in der Malerei, so it's a book about paintings and drawings of the Alps, which are one of my favorite things as well. And so this is very hard to hold up and hold into the camera, so I'm just going to show you a few pictures. So that was a very lucky find in the little free library, although I am probably going to take it back once I've looked at the pictures enough. And the last question is, what book or books do I need to have read by the end of the year? And, well, I want to finish everything that I've started at long last. However, the most important thing that I just have to kick myself in the butt and read already or finish already, but I've only started really, is The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. And I picked this to talk about because I'd like to point something out. This is the abridged one-volume version, which was authorized by Solzhenitsyn himself. The complete work is, I think, a 3-volume work, which is 3 times as long, if not more, than this abridged version. And I've seen people on BookTube and the book internet as a whole pick up the long 3-volume work and then abandon it after the first volume, completely exhausted, understandably, because that is, of course, total overkill if you are not doing it for professional research or you are somehow personally linked to the subject matter. And I'm never really sure if people are aware that this condensed version of the text exists, that has been authorized by Solzhenitsyn himself and has been translated into virtually every language. So I wanted to show you this in case you are thinking about picking up the Gulag Archipelago, but were maybe deterred by its length, or you would just generally prefer to read the condensed version. So that is it for the mid-year book freakout tag, and now that I think about it, my reading year hasn't been all that bad after all. There have been some real gems in among all the muck. If you've done the mid-year book tag, I'd love for you to point me to it in the comments, or if not, do tell me what your best and worst books of the year so far have been. I'll see you again very soon with that recent reads video I've promised. Bye guys!